In this video, I'll show you how I make a Tilda Duck from the book Hot Chocolate Sewing. I've prepared my freezer paper templates by transferring the markings. The markings on the neck and the beak of this duck are very important. So what I do is I crease the paper on both sides. These creases will help us to mark the fabric as we add it in the next step. So the way I make these geese, I basically just find a piece of fabric that will fit each segment of the goose. So here you can see I've folded the neck on that crease that I made and make sure the body fits with a little wiggle room around it. And then I found this long piece of fabric. Yes, the neck and the head will fit on there. And then I just need to find this little piece of fabric for the beak. And now we can prepare the fabric. So the first step is to take the body fabric, lay it face down, bring the pattern over, and make sure it fits because we are going to quilt this later. So fold the neck pattern over, and you can mark that line where the neck starts. So we're going to mark it here, and I like to mark kind of where the sides of the neck are, and then I'm going to cut my seam allowance. So I've moved the ruler a 1/4 inch away from where the neck is supposed to be, and I've cut my fabric. So now I'm going to attach the neck fabric. I've noted where I've made that mark, which is on this upper side of the cut that I made. And I'm just going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew straight across there. So I've sewn it, I pressed it to the dark side, and I have my body and neck. So this is why I love freezer paper templates, because I've ironed on my freezer paper template. I'm making sure that neck crease lines up with the neck seam. And now I'm going to make markings. So I'm going to mark that beak line. I'm going to mark the sides of the beak so that I know where to attach the fabric. And I'm going to bring my ruler in, and I'm going to cut, again, my seam allowance. I'm going to put my ruler a 1/4 inch outside of the line that I drew, and I'm going to make a cut. Now I've gotten kind of lazy with this pattern, or I like to cut corners. So I just do this little curvy cut here. And I'm going to bring in my beak fabric, this orange, put them right sides together. I'm going to make sure the orange beak fabric lines up nice and neat with the cut that I made. And I'm going to sew that. So this is sewn on that marked line, again, pressed to the dark side. And I like to make sure everything matches up. So yes, it does. That line is exactly on the seam that I want. I've attached fusible fleece to this side, but this is the trick to make the other side. This is where you can get really confused because you have to make a mirror image of the goose. That way it goes together. So I like to lay out the side that I already made and then lay the side that I'm working on face down on top so that I know they will match up when I go to sew them together. So here I'm just getting an idea of where the neck should fall. And I'll do the same thing I did before. I'll bring the ruler in. I will mark the line of the neck at that crease. And I will mark the sides of the neck so that I know kind of where to attach the fabric. And then I will make the cut. I'm going to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I will cut, on the outside of that drawn line that I made. And then I will do the same thing I did before. I'll add in the neck fabric. I will sew on the marked line, and I will press it to the dark side. And then in a moment, I'll show you how to add the beak again. I do like to take my time and go slow and make sure everything is lined up perfectly, because when you take your time, things do come out a little bit better. And I always like to double and triple check my work, especially with these geese, because it's kind of a tricky pattern, but you know what? Once you make one, you will be so happy you did, and you'll make a bunch more like I did. So again, I'm checking my pattern just to make sure everything will fit together when I'm ready. And yep, it looks like everything lines up. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I will match the crease on the neck with the seam that I've already made. And then I'll fold the beak back and I'll make that mark. I actually think on this one I did not draw the line, because a lot of times I will just use the ruler. And yeah, I used the ruler, gave myself, so you can kind of see even better on this video, that 1/2 inch seam allowance that I'm giving myself. And of course I grabbed my paper rotary cutter, so it didn't cut very well. But there we go. So I'm just gonna I like to mark where the edges of the beak are, just so I can make sure that I'm, sewing this beak fabric on in the right place. So line this up nice and neat. And then I'll show you a time-lapse video here of making sure it all kind of lines up. And then here, this is why I use the fusible fleece, because I like to quilt. I like to quilt the Goose. It looks so nice. So I just do a loopy loop, free motion quilting, super simple. You can do any kind of quilting that you like. Okay, it's time to match the sides. This is the first step, is you match the neck. So take your time and really match that seam, and then match the seam on the beak. So again, just go slow. This is actually a little bit time lapse, but I'm just going really, really slow and making sure it matches perfectly. You can actually feel where the seam is. So I put a pin right there in the seam, and then I come back to the neck. I put a pin in the neck, and then I do put a bunch of pins. See, that matches nicely. Just making sure. So I'll put a pin in there, and then I put a couple pins throughout the body. And then it will be time to mark the body. You're gonna laugh, but the most classic thing happened. Look at that. Ugh, whatever. That'll be okay. I think it will cut out eventually. So anyway, let's match up the beak. And that looks good. And then we'll match up where the neck crease is, so that those creases lie right on the seam. I went ahead and pressed the freezer paper template to the fabric. That bottom V is where the feet will go, so we actually cut that out, and I will sew directly across that just to make it easier. This is important. This is where I put the turning hole. So I will start and stop at these markings and leave that open so that I can stuff the duck. Okay, let's move on to the feet. I'm just making sure I have enough fabric that will fit both of the feet, so I'm just kind of fitting them on here. And I apply fusible fleece to the fabric. So doing that here, and then I'll fold this over and trace my feet. And then once the feet are traced, I will sew on the marked line through all the fabric layers. And there's my feet sewn. And here's my goose also sewn. And so in the next steps, you just cut it out. I use pinking shears to cut all around these shapes. I like to use a pretty healthy 1/4 inch seam allowance here, except for the beak, which can be a little bit finagly to turn out, which you will see shortly. So I keep the seam allowance a little bit shorter on the beak, and then you'll cut that bottom triangle out right on the line. That's where you're gonna put the feet. I did a previous video showing you how I turn my pieces out. This beak can be more challenging, so I'm actually going to slow the video down and show you exactly how I ended up turning this beak out. So instead of taking the very point and trying to get that very point in, I started kind of close to the seam between the beak and the neck. And I was able to, using my pencil with the eraser, I was able to get the beak to go in. And once I got that in, I kind of worked it down through the neck. And then I was able to reach up through the bottom foot hole to grab the beak and pulling the beak first through the hole. Then I was able to just get the rest of the duck to turn out. And here's a fun time-lapse video showing you the results. So I've tacked that midpoint together just like I do with all my other Tilda dolls, and I'm going to work on foot placement. I've already sewn in between the toes, and I've already stuffed these feet. You can see they're nice and puffy. So I'm just gonna work until I like where the feet are, and I'm gonna see what it looks like when it's standing up, and I'll re-clip it and get ready to hand sew. I hand stitch these on just like I do for all my other Tilda dolls, just like I showed you in the previous video. Except I will say the one difference is I like to use Aurifil 12 weight thread to sew the ducks. I will generally do a ladder stitch between these feet, and then I will just do a straight stitch across the feet with a sort of triple whip stitch on either side of the feet. So I just like it to be secure. Please, hand stitch this however you are comfortable. I just like to make things super durable so that when they get kicked around, they will stay in one piece. I'm pretty happy with the way these look. The next step is to stuff the goose, starting with the beak, the head, the neck, and I will generally stuff it to right below this back hole. So I like to roll up a piece of paper. It helps get the rice in. I like to use plain, cheap white rice to fill the bellies of the geese. You can put as much rice in as you like and work the rice down so it packs in there nicely. And then I will fill the rest of it with stuffing. Once I'm happy with how stuffed it is, I will use a ladder stitch and 12 weight thread, matching thread, to sew up this back opening. And once we're done with this, it's time to add the eyes and the cheeks and little finishing touches. I use pins to mark the eyes and a permanent extra fine tip micron pen. And then for the cheeks, I just use old makeup. I'm not sure if this is eyeshadow or blush, but it's a nice color, so it works really well. And then the finishing touch is a little ribbon around her neck. And I think she's good to go. Thanks for watching.